All right, we are live. Okay, so are you feeling overwhelmed? Are you overcommitted and distracted? Today, I am so excited to be joined by my friend Melanie Sodka, the capacity creator. She's a human behavior enthusiast, a podcaster, an international speaker, and just an overall amazing human being who I adore and have the most amazing conversations with. So, welcome, Melanie. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you for having us. I just remember during the pandemic, you and I having these conversations. We're like, darn it, we should have recorded that. Like other people could have just benefited from these topics, right? So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Amazing. Yeah, it's funny how, and I think it's so timely because people are just so overwhelmed. We're so distracted, right? I find myself deleting apps like my social media apps from my phone just so that I don't, but yet I still find myself drawn to like pick it up and like, oh, it's not there anymore. And wanting that distraction, that busyness. And the work that you do is really to help people, I guess, identify that and reduce the overwhelm so they can create more time for the things that they love to do. So tell us a bit more about what you do and how you do that.
Yeah, capacity is a big word. And it's interesting because, the business is called Capacity Creator, and it was born out of a state of burnout. And it was a time when I was like, I need to help identify, like, where am I operating out of? Why am I saying yes so much? Or why am I not saying yes enough? I mean, I was saying too many yeses, obviously, because it led to burnout. So I wanted to just research and observe how other people were making these decisions and what it was leading to. Because burnout was also on the rise pre-pandemic and then just like exploded during the pandemic. And then, ironically, capacity is this word that we hear every, 5 minutes on the news and any, local newspaper or feed that we're watching. And so, capacity is, I'll just set the tone for the listeners too. It's different than time. Time is very much task oriented. It's scheduled, whereas capacity makes up of like our mental, our emotional, our physical capacity. So, just because you might have an hour this weekend or 2 hours free in your calendar doesn't mean that you can go ahead and book it and, go through with this task, because you might not have that mental capacity. You might be drained. You might just not be able to show up in a way that would be acceptable or that you would be happy. So this work is important because it's really about burnout prevention. That's where a lot of this work is done, is to help establish common language.
Yeah. And I think that's such an interesting thing. Just because you have the time in your schedule doesn't mean you actually have the capacity
Yeah.
to do it. Now, I feel like boundaries is probably one of those words, right? You said you said yes to a lot of things. I'm completely guilty of that too. And just like, oh, yeah, I'll open up my schedule to allow people to book calls. And then I'm like, oh, now I have 10 calls today. Like, and it ebbs and flows where I'm like, no, I'm going to create really strong boundaries around my time. So do you have any, what's your guidance for people to create this capacity in their lives, in their businesses, so that they have more time and they are not burnt out and overwhelmed and searching for those distractions?
Yeah, this is something that I consistently work on myself because I am a yes person. And a lot of our yeses come from FOMO. And I think, growing up and in this hustle culture, we're taught to say yes. And if we don't, we could be missing a very valuable opportunity or missing out on an experience. So I think a lot of that drives our yeses. So we have to be very cognizant of, are we really going to miss out on like this big, huge opportunity, or are we just fooling ourselves? But in order for me to kind of keep things organized and in perspective, I usually go by the rule of three. And I do this with my clients. It's so easy. So I have them create 3 columns and 3 rows. I call it the 3x3. And what I want them to do is I want them just to establish the top 3 roles that they play in their lives. So whether that be, a parent, whether that be a professional, an entrepreneur, a volunteer, a philanthropist, whatever that is, rank the top 3. Obviously, we a lot of us play more than 3 roles. Beside those roles, establish one goal that you want to achieve in that role. And then that third column is a control. So what is it? What success metric? How do you know you'll be successful in reaching that goal that's going to honor that role? And I find that keeping my 3 roles or even like 3 projects intact in front of me allows me to create those boundaries to say no to everything else that doesn't apply or will not support those roles and those goals. And like on my phone, Laura, I have like my 3 big projects right now. So it's not necessarily rules, maybe it is, but it's podcaster, book, and working on, the scientifically validating my capacity assessment. Those are the 3 big things that I have going on in my business life that I have to stick to. If I don't, I'll never get any of those things done. So that's one thing that the listeners can definitely do, just outline what are the top 3 things, attach a goal to it, and attach a control to it so you can measure that success.
Got it. So by control, you mean like just that it's measurable?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. I think of control like I've got control of the situation and something.
I picked the word control because it was like role, goal, control. It was just a lot easier to try to remember, right?
Yeah, but right, role, goal, control.
Yeah.
That's great because I think, like you said, I like having that for like my 3 roles is, who I am as a person, entrepreneur, a mother, all of these things. And then, but also the projects and like, what am I working on so that you don't get distracted by every shiny object and say yes to everything when you know exactly what you need to be focusing on. And I did a sort of a version of that, but now I want to go back and apply your model to what I had created, because I feel like that would help me clarify that even more and stay, on task. So if you're joining us, welcome. And if you have questions for Melanie, or, you're struggling with something around creating capacity or burnout, please do share and we'll get her to answer any questions, while we've got her here. I wanted to ask you, I feel like you mentioned this word addiction to distraction. And I think we are addicted in many ways to the distractions, to our phones. We're addicted to this busyness, this feeling of, I don't know if it makes us feel more important and needing to be doing things all the time. And that wearing that like a badge of honor. And I know you and I have talked about that on your podcast, hustle culture and like this feeling like we have to be going all the time. And, I just would love to dive deeper into that. And how do we battle this addiction to our phones, to the distractions, in order to really find that focus?
Yeah. And this is like, it's the $8 billion question because, we do work from our phone. I find myself like having to remind my kids that I'm not on my phone, just kind of scrolling away. I'm actually doing work. So being aware of like where that work is done, who you're around, how often you check your phone, what are your habits? I think it's almost like auditing just your current habits in terms of how you use your device, because that device is, yes, it's great for work, but it's also a wonderful distracting tool. That is, partially built to distract you and to engage you. So I think like just auditing and just being aware is a really big thing. And the other thing, when we are addicted to distraction, we get these hits of, dopamine, right? We get these like this addiction to adrenaline where we get the notifications. We're actually addicted to the notifications. Like, when is someone going to respond back, and waiting for that response and anticipation. So, that also causes a big issue. So much so that, and I talk about this in the TEDx too, is that all of those chemical reactions, the dopamine, the adrenaline, the cortisol from the anxiety, like all of that floods our body. And it actually is flooding our bodies at this pace that we can't actually break it down naturally. So it's causing a lot of health issues that we might not know much about yet. So I'm watching that because I'm so scientifically intrigued by this notion. So that's just a little bit of that in terms of just really being cognizant of how we engage with our devices, how long, what for. I'll usually try and do the 5 to 6 p.m. no phone zone, where it's like my husband and I and the kids, all devices are down. It's 1 hour device free, TV free, like it's just us time. Because if we don't have that time, we'll never get it. So that's one quick tip.
Yeah. What I find is that we control everything from our devices. So I could be like, I'd love to have a device free day, but we control our music, like,
yeah.
Like so many things are just oh, I am not checking my email, or I'm not checking my social. I'm putting music on for
Right.
us in the house. And, oh, I'm changing the temperature, or, all of these things are on our devices. So it's
Yeah,
not just one thing, it's so many things. And I wonder too, is this actually changing our brains, like how our brains are wired?
absolutely.
People aren't reading. That's one thing I say, like, people aren't reading. Like, that's where you have to break things down. You could send an email with 5 points and you'll get an answer to one question if
Exactly.
you get a response back to your email, right? So
Yeah. We're
it
overloaded. We're just overloaded, overwhelmed. We are so accessible. There's this great article, I think it was printed in the New York Times about 3 or 4 months ago, and it was about accessibility 24/7 in every channel. Like, I have students, I'm also a business professor. I have students that if they don't get a response at the college email within, I don't know, 20 minutes, they'll come find me on social and private message me. like, like it's just, what if we weren't accessible 24/7? What would the world look like? How could we better, you talk about boundaries, how can we better implement some of these boundaries? So I find it ironic that we've, adopted all of this technology to make our lives easier, better, more efficient, yet now we're spending a lot more time and capacity managing boundaries to save us from that distraction. So again, it's really starting about, like, what is the relationship you have with your device? What relationship do you want with your device? And almost sounds like counseling here.
what's I mean, it is. I mean, it's
Yeah.
the thing that we carry around with us. It's with us more than any person,
Yeah,
right? People take it into the bathroom with it. Like, people take this
they do. Yeah.
everywhere, right? You go for a walk, I'm listening to podcasts, or I'm listening to music, and then you get a text message and you're this. And, like, if people are out of contact, you kind of wonder, like, when we weren't at home, as kids, our parents didn't know where we were or what we were up to. Now, we were just in Mexico, and my older son was like, we were looking for my husband and younger son, and he pulls up and tracks them, like, with whatever I don't
Yeah.
even see. I don't even know how to find that feature on my phone. But at 14, he's like, oh, they're over at this part of the resort. And he literally, like, tracked them down using his phone. I'm like,
I think, to your point too, that it does rewire our brains. If I think about my parents who are in their, like, mid to late 60s, they didn't grow up with this, right? So they're not digital natives whatsoever. So they grew up with this kind of, like, maybe in their 40s, 50s. And now they have their phones too. And, like, that is just the relationship that we've established, that if I need to get a hold of you quickly, it's your cell phone. It's not your landline anymore, if anybody has one.
yeah,
So I think it does rewire the brain. I think people are now more prone to being distracted a lot more often. And our attention span, that you alluded to too, because we are accessible all the time, has diminished. And our tolerance for information has almost diminished.
yeah,
So there's a lot of science around that too.
yeah. I
Mhm.
feel like our attention is so pulled in
Yeah.
50 million different directions. I was chatting with somebody this morning about just the onslaught of visual images that we see
Yeah.
every day, let alone caught text. Like, I read a study, and this was pre-pandemic, that we see about 100,000 words a day, which I'm sure is, like, probably doubled by now. And then imagery, like, everybody's now online. Like, if you weren't online before, or on social or anything, you sure are now. And we're just constantly being kind of bombarded by
Yeah.
visual images and words. And it's a lot to take in. And so
It's triggering too. We forget how much of that is triggering.
a lot of it is
Yeah,
triggering, in
absolutely.
fact. And it's too much for us to kind of handle. I was hearing, somebody said this to me recently, and it hit me so deeply, that, our hearts were not meant to carry the pain and trauma of the world. It
Ugh.
was just meant to carry the pain and trauma of our village.
Mm,
I'm like, oh,
wow.
that's deep. It hit
Yeah,
me so deeply, because I'm like, every day we're seeing images of the atrocities and things happening all around the
yeah.
world. And we just literally don't have the capacity to deal with that. And so
No,
we just, we put up barriers, and it's not that we don't care,
right.
but if we all cared so much, we would just be puddles on the floor and not be able to function, or at least me.
You're right. We don't have the capacity to absorb. We don't have the capacity to process. I don't think we were built for that. But like if we take it back to the device, I mean, here we are given these devices with no handbook, with no instruction manual. I mean, and I think we've talked about this too. I have a 12-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old boy, and they do not have phones, and they will not have access to phones until they're a little bit older, especially my daughter at this point, because what are the rules? Like, how do we establish the rules? I can as a parent, but then there's this whole influx of external influence that will then teach her things that I can't counter necessarily. And so, the longer we wait, in our opinion, the better she can establish her own boundaries, the more conversation, more room for conversation. And so I just feel like, to your point, it's like we're given these devices, we're given these tools with no etiquette lesson, with no, handbook, user book, anything. It's like, here, go and use and figure it out.
Yeah.
And I think that just becomes very overwhelming, especially for this Gen Z and Alpha generation.
Yeah. And I think especially because of virtual school that they've been in for the better part of the last 2 years. And now even in classes, my son's in high school and they're allowed to have their phones in class. Half the time they're on their phones in class.
Yes.
Like why are you, first of all, why do you have a phone in the classroom? That should be in your locker. You finally now can access a locker. So why are they not in the lockers? But nobody's actually getting these kids off their phones in class. And I have a problem. I'm like,
yeah,
the things they've been learning, it's really hard to undo everything that's happened. And it's creating these habits
exactly.
that are going to be really tough. It's hard enough as an adult. Like I literally removed email from my phone.
Yes.
I have no access to email from my cell phone. People are like, how do you, I'm like, because I do not need to. I only want to look at email on my computer. And even then, most of the time I don't want to look at it. So I definitely don't need to be sitting on my sofa at 10 o'clock at night, checking my email.
Well, it's funny that we've adopted this technology and then we've created habits that are harmful. And then, what came in after that wasn't like let's challenge our habits and course correct. Let's, establish an anxiety economy where we are going to, provide quick fixes to people that have this heightened anxiety because they are accessible 24/7, because they're overworked, because they're overwhelmed. So in come squishy toys, fidget spinners, weighted blankets, salt lamps, you name it, all these apps to temporarily, solve that or ease that pain. But it still continues. So I see it like it's just a cycle that continues to build itself, which is fascinating but scary at the same time.
Yeah. And I guess we've probably done that forever I
think we've adopted that way. Yeah.
It's just sort of what we do, but now this has really been accelerated. So from a business perspective, right? A lot of people that I'm connected with are entrepreneurs. So, boundaries, saying no to things, knowing what to say yes to. And I feel like you talked about that with that framework. Why do we have so much trouble with creating boundaries? Do you have any thoughts on what that's all about?
I do. And it takes me back to a specific generation. I just spoke to 200 Canadian business students from across Canada who gathered at their first in-person, conference in 2 years. So a lot of them will range from the age of 18, 22, and they're all in the same room. And I talked to them about capacity, and I talked about burnout, and I talked about hustle culture. And, I wasn't exactly sure how it would have been received because I am the voice that says you can say no to things. They are of the generation that have been told, no, you can't say no to things. And so what I realized after too, in conversation with people who came up after the keynote, was they just don't know, to your point, how to create those boundaries. And what we distilled is there's like a misalignment or just a lack of alignment with personal values. And I think there's the value mining is so important. And I know that that's a difficult stage to really establish those values at that age because you're trying things out, you're experimenting, you're finding yourself. But I still think there's not enough emphasis. There's a lack of support for this generation to really align themselves with values, give themselves permission to create boundaries and to say no to things. And when we had that conversation with a small group afterwards, their eyes lit up. Like something struck a chord where we're just not having these discussions enough. I don't think there's enough dialogue or support or motivation, encouragement, what have you, to say like, what are your values? How are your values going to support your boundaries? Because you can write out, Laura, both you and I, we can write, we're not going to take part in this, or we're going to say no to this. But as soon as something influences or has enough strength to change our minds, we might say yes.
Yep.
And that might be because we have a weakened value, or we're just not paying attention. So I think that's a really big piece that's missing from the conversation.
Yeah, I love that, actually, this connection to your values. I think that's really key. And so something that I've done, so I did kind of figure out what my values are recently, like just really kind of solidify those. But I have sort of a list of, I have 3 values, but I have a list of, I call them desires, because I was like, it felt different than values, but literally I have 8 words on that list, and they are how I want to live my life in every aspect of my life. It doesn't mean every day is going to have these these desires, but every morning I write, what am I living for today? And it's I've got to have at least one of those words on. And so I'm very intentionally start my day knowing, and those words are what helps me decide what business opportunities or what personal things or family things, because it's deeply aligned with who I am and how I want to live my life in all areas. And I've found, since I've started doing that, and then at the end of the day, I do the review and I write like, how did I live those desires today?
Wow.
And I've been doing that every day since the beginning of this year, very consistently.
That's huge, because that is setting up your day with intention and holding yourself accountable. Like, that is such a deep practice that I think a lot of people are doing. So hopefully listeners are like, well, copy that and just like take a moment at the beginning of the day, set your intentions. At the end of the day, did you actually accomplish what you said you were going to accomplish? So I love that. That's beautiful.
I have a personal manifesto of like things I've learned from different mindset coaches and programs and all the things. And it's like, a combination of all the things that to me were really valuable. And so I have that. It's like, I don't know how many pages, 6 or 8 pages. And I just kind of read through that every morning as well. It's like, this is how, and it just says my big, bold, beautiful life. And every morning I read that, because it's just, again, it's so easy to get lost in the day-to-day and the to-do lists. And, it happens to me all the time. You get caught up in the hustle. And there's been a lot of times lately where I've overscheduled myself completely. And then you do get burnt out. And I'm like, that has to change, because that does not fit with the desires that I have for my life.
Exactly. I love it. Like, you just have to come up with this framework that's going to allow you to live within those boundaries. And it's a discipline. And that word is not popular right now. It is not, because discipline has this like negative, like difficult connotation to it. It's like, we don't have to be disciplined. We can kind of live by the seat of our pants. We can kind of wake up and do what it is that our heart wants. And I feel like there's all of that, out there too. Like, just live your life. You only live once. All of this stuff that's influencing and countering. Just structure is okay. Setting intentions is okay. I think it's maybe just a language swap, but yeah, I agree with you there for sure.
Well, and I think this idea of like being free and living like that idea, I think, but you can still be disciplined within that.
Yes.
Right? Like, it's almost like the yin and yang. Like,
I know.
how can you not be? Because that to me is like perfectly describes me. Like, I do like structure. I do like to have things, organized, but I also want that excitement and that freedom and that adventure and the unknown, but not all the, it is an interesting place to live. And I feel like if you're overly disciplined or you're overly free, you're kind of on these 2 extremes, and it is a spectrum.
For sure.
And I feel like you have to find the right place for you within that. And one end to the other isn't necessarily right or wrong. And we're all different. So it's finding the right place.
I thought you were going to say like, find the balance. And I don't know about you, but and the listeners too, but every time I hear balance and work-life balance, I get this like cringe impulse, because I think it's so elusive. Like, it's nothing. I don't think balance can ever be achieved. I think it's always a work in progress. I think the balance today will look different tomorrow and the next day. And I think just because of the evolving nature of our lives and circumstances and the way we have to adapt, I think our definition of balance today is different than it's going to be tomorrow. So I didn't know if you were going to go there, but just to add on to the values piece, which I think is really interesting. I love the way you phrased it too. It's like, how do I want to live? So I'm going to look to adjust mine. But the way that I look at my values too is like, where have I naturally made decisions from? Right? That there are themes that you can actually go back and look at, like, what are the real reasons at the core of the decisions that you've made. And I really took a look at that, and I do this with clients too, and we have this whole exercise, but it's like, for me, it's connection, it's gratitude, and generosity. And those have just been the common 3 themes throughout my entire life that pretty much help inform those decisions. So those values aren't really hard. I know sometimes people think, oh my gosh, like, how am I going to find? I got to go value mine. I got to look through the list. It becomes overwhelming. They're like, forget it, not doing it, right? But think back to some of those core themes for the listeners too, if you're looking for those values, how you make those decisions from which place.
Yeah. One thing that a good friend of mine shared with me about really finding your true values is that to find the shadow side of that value.
Yes.
I'd never heard that before. So that was a new concept to me, because you've got to, there's that, like, the good side of your value, but there's also like the shadow side. So one of mine is harmony.
Mm-hmm.
And, obviously I love, that word, it sounds great, but the shadow side of that is I have trouble with difficult conversations and communication and, that side of things. So it's like, I value harmony so much that I will do things to be a people pleaser and to, like, avoid the conflict to keep the harmony. Right. Yeah. So that was how I came to that word, was like that idea of the positive side, but also identifying, yes, there is that side of me that this is also a negative. So I really liked that as a counterpoint. And it also made me so much more aware of that shadow side of the word.
100%. The other way to look at it too, just to I guess add to that, is what just pisses you off, like what violates your core values or like your core internal compass. And as soon as you figure that out, that's the dark side. What's the flip side of that, right? And then you can say, that is a core value of mine. Like, I can't handle it when people like take up too much airtime. Well, then that violates my connection value, because that means that people don't have a chance to speak or to connect. And so it's an interesting, I love the dark side too. That's a great one.
Yeah. And I don't know if everybody knows about that side of identifying your value. I found that to be really profound in that experience for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And connection's one of mine as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It is so valuable. You always have so many amazing insights, and I love our conversations. If anybody has any questions, we haven't had any so far, but if you do if you're watching the replay, pop it into the comments, tag Melanie or me, and we're happy to answer anything. So once again, thank you so much, Melanie, for joining me today.
Yeah, another beautiful conversation. Thanks, Laura.
So next Tuesday, March 29th, I'm going to be joined by my good friend, Jill Valentine from Yugo Impact. She's a transformational travel coach. She takes people on these epic volunteer travel experiences to places like Tanzania to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. So she's got some really cool stuff we're going to chat about next week on Tuesday. So I hope to see you all there. And until then, have an amazing week.
Take care.